good evening, or good morning if that's the truer thing where you are right now. I'm glad you found your way here because the story waiting for you tonight is one I've wanted to tell for a long while. A story of ambition, water, and patience, carried out entirely in the dark beneath one of the busiest rivers in the world. So settle yourself properly. Let the lights come down if they haven't already. Turn the phone face down, pull the blanket up over your shoulder, and let go of any need to stay awake for what comes next, because that isn't what tonight is for. If you'd like, leave a word down in the comments telling me where in the world you're listening from and what the clock says there right now. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me while I talk. Now let yourself settle in and let's begin. There was a river that no one believed could be tunneled. Not because no one had tried. Men had tried and failed, and in trying, some of them had drowned, but because the ground beneath that river was little more than mud held together by habit, soft and shifting and utterly without mercy toward anything built into it. Above that ground moved the great trade of an empire, tall-masted ships passing back and forth in an endless procession, carrying the food, the fuel, and the fortune of a city that never seemed to stop needing more of both. To go beneath such a river without daylight, without any way of seeing more than an arm's length ahead, was considered by most sensible engineers of the age to be closer to a wish than an actual plan. And yet, in the 1820s, a small group of determined and rather stubborn men decided to attempt it anyway. What they built has come down to us as the Thames Tunnel, and it remains even now, 2 centuries on, one of the strangest and most patient acts of engineering ever carried out beneath a city. Its designer was a Frenchman named Marc Brunel, an engineer who had already spent a working life solving problems that other men had quietly given up on. Beside him stood his son, still young, not yet the towering figure of railways and iron ships he would later become, given the grand title of resident engineer almost before he had grown fully into the name Isambard Brunel. And keeping the record of it all, the delays, the floods, the funerals, and the small, hard-won triumphs, was an assistant named Richard Beamish, whose notebooks are, in many ways, the reason you and I can still stand beside these men tonight in the dark and watch them work. If stories like this one are the kind that help you drift off, you're welcome to stay with this channel for more of them in the nights to come. More rivers, more bridges, more men who built past the edge of what their own century thought possible. But that's a thought for later. Tonight belongs entirely to the river, and to the tunnel that took years longer than anyone promised, and cost far more than anyone admitted it would, and very nearly drowned the men who dared to dig it. Picture for a moment the Thames as it was then, not the tidied, embanked river you might picture today, but a working river crowded shoulder to shoulder with vessels, its banks a chaos of wharves, cranes, coal heavers, and rope walks, its surface thick with the smoke of 100 small fires and the shouting of men who had been up since before light. If you had stood on its bank at dusk, you would have felt the whole city breathing through that water, barges low and heavy with grain, colliers waiting their turn, watermen ferrying passengers from shore to shore for a coin, because there was, at that stretch of river, no bridge close enough to matter and no way across except by boat or by a very long walk. You would have smelled tar and coal smoke and the particular mineral smell of river mud before you smelled anything else, and underneath it all, if you listened, the low creak of hulls settling against their moorings as the tide began its long pull back out to sea. But what was it about this particular stretch of river that made a bridge impossible and a tunnel, however unlikely, the only remaining hope? That question was already old by the time Brunel arrived to answer it, and it will carry us into everything that follows, but there's no need to hurry toward it tonight. There is nothing here you need to hold on to, nothing to remember or rehearse in your mind before sleep takes you. You can let the shapes of the story move past you the way the barges once moved past that riverbank, unhurried, indifferent to whether you're watching closely or already half gone. For now, it's enough to know that downriver from London Bridge, where the docks grew busiest and the ships grew largest, no bridge could be built without either stopping the great masts from passing beneath it, or raising a structure so tall and so costly that no one dared propose it seriously. The river there was wide, deep, and utterly essential to the trade that kept London fed and wealthy, and nothing could be allowed to interrupt that endless procession of hulls for the sake of getting dock workers and cart horses from one bank to the other. A tunnel, if it could be built at all, would let the traffic above continue exactly as it always had, while something else entirely happened in the dark beneath it, a second hidden crossing, invisible to the ships passing overhead, felt by no one at the surface at all. That idea alone had drawn men to failure before Brunel ever set foot near the river. You would have heard their names spoken in the taverns near the docks, the way people speak of gamblers who lost everything on a single reckless wager. Men who had sunk shafts into that same soft ground, who had pushed forward a few feet into clay and silt that seemed solid enough until the river found its way in, and the diggings flooded, and the whole scheme was abandoned along with whatever money had been thrown into it. By the time Marc Brunel came to study the problem, the Thames already had something of a reputation as a river that ate tunnels the way it ate ships in a storm, quietly and without ceremony, leaving little behind but rumor. None of that discouraged him. If anything, it seems to have interested him more, the way a difficult lock interests a man who has spent his life picking them. Brunel had a mind that turned naturally toward the kind of problem other engineers set aside as unsolvable, and he had, tucked away, an idea that no one else working the riverbanks of London had yet thought to try, a way of holding back the ground itself, while men dug through it piece by piece in the pitch dark, without the whole face of the excavation collapsing in on them the moment it was disturbed. It would take him years to turn that idea into iron and timber and something that could actually be built, and it would take his son and Beamish and hundreds of labourers whose names were never written down at all to carry it the rest of the way. But that idea, quiet, strange, and almost absurdly simple once you understand it, is where the real story of this tunnel begins, and it's the very thing we'll step into together next, once you've let yourself sink a little further into the dark of the room around you. The idea, as Beamish would later record it, had come to Brunel years earlier, far from any riverbank at all, while he sat turning over a piece of old ship's timber in his hands, the kind pulled rotten and honeycombed from a hull that had spent too many seasons in warm water. Some small creature had bored through that wood in 1,000 directions, and yet the timber had not collapsed into splinters as it worked. Each tunnel the creature carved was lined almost immediately with a hard shell of its own making, so that the soft, blind passage behind it was always protected before the next inch was cut. Brunel turned the wood over under a lens for a long while before he understood what he was looking at. Here was a creature with no strength of its own to speak of, moving through a substance far harder than itself, simply by protecting its work as it went, rather than trusting to luck or speed. It was not a grand insight, dressed in any of the language engineers usually reached for. It was patient, almost humble, and it stayed with him. What would it mean, he began to wonder, to dig the way that creature dug, to advance through soft, treacherous ground, not by rushing forward and hoping the roof held, but by shielding the working face itself, inch by inch, so that the ground was never given the chance to fail before it had already been made safe. A structure that moved forward like a case or a shell, holding back the mud and clay on every side while men worked in the small dark space it created, then locking each finished length behind them in brick before advancing again. It was an idea that could be drawn on paper easily enough. Whether it could be built in iron, sunk into real ground beneath a real and indifferent river, was an entirely different question. And it was the question that would occupy the rest of Brunel's working life and very nearly end it before a single shaft was ever sunk. Picture the river as it was then, not as it is now. If you had stood on the north bank somewhere near Wapping on a clear morning, you would not have seen water so much as timber, mast after mast, packed so close along both shores that a man could have believed the whole city had been built on ships rather than beside them. That was London's river, the busiest working water in the world, and it was also the wall that cut the city cleanly in two. You could stand on one bank and watch the far shore going about its business, wagons and porters and church bells, and know that reaching it would cost you the better part of an hour and quite possibly your patience along with it. There is nothing you need to hold on to in any of what follows tonight. Only let the picture settle, the masts and the smoke and the slow brown water, and the rest will come to you gently, the way a story comes to you when you are already half asleep. East of London Bridge there was no way across at all. Not one crossing, not for the dock workers of Wapping, not for the rope makers and coopers and ship's chandlers of Rotherhithe on the far bank, not for the carters bringing goods down from the warehouses toward the sea. If your business took you from one side of the docks to the other, you had exactly two choices, and neither of them was good. You could walk or ride all the way west to London Bridge itself, fighting through cart traffic that barely moved even at the best of hours, adding miles to a journey that ought to have taken minutes. Or you could take a boat, a wherry, rowed across by watermen who made their whole living on that short, wet crossing, charging what they liked because they knew you had no other way over. In bad weather, in fog, in the black hours before dawn when the first shifts began at the docks, that crossing could be dangerous as well as expensive. Men drowned making it. Nobody kept a careful count, but everybody on the riverside knew somebody who had gone into the water and not come out of it. This was not a small inconvenience to a handful of travelers. It was a wound in the economic life of the busiest port on earth. Ships from every ocean unloaded at those docks. Sugar, tobacco, timber, spices, the whole trade of an empire funneling through a few miles of crowded riverbank, and every pound of it eventually had to move from a warehouse on one side to a market or a workshop on the other. Every delay cost money. Every drowned waterman, every overturned cart, every hour lost to the crush at London Bridge was a small tax paid by a city that could not afford to be slow. If you had walked the wharves at Rotherhithe with a merchant of that era, he would have told you, without much prompting, that a proper crossing east of the bridge would be worth a fortune to whoever built it. And that fortune, more than any love of engineering for its own sake, was what kept the idea alive in the minds of investors for decades. A bridge seemed the obvious answer until you tried to design one. This stretch of river was thick with shipping, tall-masted vessels moving in and out on the tide, and any bridge low enough to be affordable would have to open or lift or swing, interrupting the very traffic it was meant to serve. A bridge high enough to let the masts pass beneath without moving at all would need approaches so long and so steep that they would eat up half of Wapping and Rotherhithe just getting up to height, swallowing streets and homes and yards that had stood for generations. Every engineer who looked seriously at the problem arrived at more or less the same uncomfortable conclusion that the crossing London needed east of the bridge was not a bridge at all. It needed to go under the river, not over it, so that the ships above could carry on exactly as they always had, entirely unaware that anyone was passing beneath their keels. It is a lovely thought to fall asleep on if you let it, a road running quietly under the water while, above, the tide and the traffic go on as they always have, neither one troubling the other. But a tunnel under a tidal river was not a new idea in the years this story concerns itself with, and it had not gone well the last time anyone had tried it, which is exactly the kind of thing an investor remembers when a fresh proposal lands on his desk. That earlier attempt belonged to Richard Trevithick, a Cornish engineer already well known for his work with high-pressure steam, a restless and difficult man who had made and lost several fortunes chasing ideas other people thought impossible. In the early years of the century, Trevithick had taken on the challenge of driving a tunnel beneath the Thames, working from a shaft sunk on the south bank and pushing a heading out under the riverbed toward the north. For a time it seemed to be going well enough. Then it wasn't. The ground beneath the Thames was not solid rock, but a shifting, unpredictable mix of gravel, sand, and soft clay, riddled with old scours and buried channels where the river itself had once run in some earlier age, leaving pockets of loose, waterlogged ground exactly where a tunnel most needed firm footing. Trevithick's men drove into one of those pockets, and the river came in on top of them. Nobody died in that particular flood, which by the standards of what would come later at this very site counts as good fortune. But the water came in fast enough, and in enough volume that the men working the heading had to scramble for the shaft with the river at their heels, and the attempt was abandoned soon after. Trevithick himself, by most accounts, proposed sinking enormous iron cylinders into the riverbed instead and connecting them below, a scheme nobody would fund, and one that never left the drawing board. The tunnel was given up. The shaft was left to flood and silt over, and the lesson every engineer in London drew from it was simple and discouraging. The ground under the Thames could not be trusted, and any man who told you otherwise had not yet met it. That failure did not vanish quietly. It hung over the whole idea of a Thames tunnel for years afterward, the way a bad accident hangs over a stretch of road long after the wreckage has been cleared. Whenever the subject came up again, and in a city as hungry for a crossing as this one, it always did come up again, somebody in the room would mention Trevithick, and the mention would do exactly what it was meant to do. It would make the investors quiet. So when did anyone dare propose the idea seriously again, and what made him think he had actually solved the problem Trevithick had not? The answer arrives in the person of a French engineer who had already spent much of his working life proving that other people's impossible was simply a problem nobody had looked at correctly. Marc Brunel had left France as a young man, unwilling to live under the government the revolution had produced, and had made his way eventually to London by way of America, arriving with almost nothing beyond his own considerable talent and a restless, inventive habit of mind that never seemed to sit still. By the time this story finds him, he had already built a name for himself designing machinery. Most famously, the equipment that mass-produced ship's pulley blocks for the Royal Navy, a system so effective that it did the work of dozens of skilled craftsmen with a handful of unskilled operators tending machines. He had drawn bridges, sawmills, boot-making machinery, a dozen schemes that ranged from the brilliant to the faintly absurd. What he had never done was tunnel under a river. But watching the failure of men who had tried it, Brunel became convinced quietly and then not so quietly that the problem was not the river at all. The problem was that nobody had yet found the right way to hold the ground back while you worked inside it. If you have ever watched a bricklayer work behind a temporary shore, holding raw earth back with nothing more than timber and patience, while he builds the permanent wall behind it, you have already seen in miniature the idea Brunel was reaching for. He wanted something that could do that job at the scale of a tunnel, moving forward as the work advanced, holding the mud and gravel and groundwater of the Thames away from the men inside, just long enough for them to build a permanent lining behind it, brick by brick, before advancing again into ground that had never been touched. It was, on paper, a simple enough answer to a problem that had drowned Trevithick's ambitions outright. Whether it would survive contact with the river itself was a different matter, and it is exactly that structure, the iron frame Brunel believed could succeed where a Cornish engineer's raw courage had not, that the story turns to next. Marc Brunel had been turning the problem over for years before the answer arrived, and when it did, it arrived from somewhere no one else had thought to look. He had spent time around the naval dockyards, watching timber brought in from old ships, and it was there, examining a piece of ship's wood eaten through by the shipworm, a small marine creature that bores through timber as it feeds, that he found what he needed. If you had been standing beside him at that workbench, you would have seen nothing remarkable at first. A length of oak, riddled with narrow tunnels, soft and honeycombed where the worm had passed. But Brunel looked closer, the way engineers do when something ordinary refuses to let go of their attention, and he noticed that the creature did not simply chew its way blindly forward. As it advanced, it lined the tunnel behind it with a hard, shell-like paste, sealing the passage as it went, so that the soft timber never collapsed in on the soft creature doing the boring. It occurred to him, in that quiet, unhurried way that real invention seems to work, that a machine built on the same principle might do for a tunnel under the Thames what the worm did for its passage through wood, advance in a protected shell, and leave a hardened lining in its wake. There is nothing you need to hold on to here beyond that single image, because the whole of what follows grew out of it. From the shipworm, Brunel built what he called a tunneling shield, though the word shield undersells what it actually was. Picture, if you will, an iron frame roughly the height of a house standing on end, divided from top to bottom and side to side into a grid of separate cells, rather like a bookcase turned to face the wall of earth it was meant to hold back. Each cell was large enough to hold one man, working alone, facing a small section of the wet London clay and gravel in front of him. He would remove a board, dig forward a few inches into the ground the board had been holding back, and then push the board out again to seal the new gap before moving to the next. Because the ground was divided into so many small, separately controlled sections, no single miner ever had more than a few feet of exposed earth in front of him at any one time, and if that earth chose to slump or run with water, only a narrow strip of the work was threatened rather than the whole face at once. The frame itself did not simply sit there, it was built to be pushed forward, cell by cell, on great iron screws braced against the finished brick lining behind it, so that the whole assembly crept into virgin ground the way the shipworm crept into virgin timber, sealing its passage as it advanced. Behind the miners, another set of hands followed with brick and mortar, building the permanent tunnel lining into the space the shield had just vacated, so that by the time the iron frame had crawled forward its own length, a ring of solid brickwork stood exactly where raw river mud had been only days before. If you had climbed down into that shaft and walked toward the working face, you would have heard it before you saw it. The scrape of iron against gravel, the wet suck of clay being drawn back through narrow boards, water dripping somewhere unseen, and underneath all of it, very faint, the distant, indifferent hum of the river going about its business, 30-odd feet above your head. It must have felt like standing inside the very idea Brunel had first noticed in that piece of dockyard timber, except that the timber, this time, was the whole of London's ground, and the creature doing the boring wore boots and carried a lamp. It was, on the drawing board at least, an answer of real elegance to a problem that had already claimed one engineer's reputation, and Brunel knew it. He also knew, being the kind of man who had spent years in French and English patent offices before he ever crossed the Atlantic to make his name, that an idea this good needed to be protected before it could be trusted to anyone else. He filed for his patent in the early 1800s and 1818 specifically, describing the shield in careful technical language, the cells and the screws, and the sequence of digging and lining, so that whatever came next, success or failure, the invention itself would remain unmistakably his. That protection mattered more than it might seem from a comfortable distance of 2 centuries. Men had lost credit for their own work before, and Brunel had already tasted enough professional disappointment in his life to want the record straight from the outset. But securing the paper was, in its own way, the easy part. An idea this elegant, however carefully it was written down and sealed with wax, was still only an idea. It could not dig a single inch of London clay on its own, and it could not pay for a single brick. So where does a shipwright's son with a patent and a promising sketch find the money to test an unproven machine against a river that had already humiliated one of the most admired engineers in the country? The answer, as it so often was in that period, lay in persuading men who had never held a shovel to believe in a hole they would never personally climb into. Trevithick's failed attempt was still fresh enough in London's memory that raising capital for a second try at tunnelling beneath the Thames was, to put it gently, an uphill conversation. Investors who might otherwise have been drawn to the scheme now had a specific and recent cautionary tale to point to, a flooded shaft and an abandoned drift, and they were not shy about pointing to it. Brunel needed something more than a clever drawing to overcome that memory, and what he and his supporters eventually settled on was respectability by association. A company was formed to carry the project forward, and it secured the patronage of the Crown itself, lending the enterprise a kind of institutional weight that a private engineer's word alone could not provide. It did not make the river any less wet, and it did not make the ground beneath it any less inclined to collapse, but it gave nervous men of capital something to stand behind besides Brunel's own confidence, and in the funding rooms of London, that mattered enormously. Slowly, unevenly, the subscriptions came in. It was around this same uncertain, hopeful stretch of the project's life that another name begins to appear in the record beside Marc Brunel's own, and it belonged to his son. Isambard Kingdom. Brunel was still a young man, largely unknown outside his father's own circle, when he stepped into the project at his father's side, drawn into the daily business of the tunnel almost as an apprenticeship in the family trade. There is no need to hurry past this quietly, because it is worth sitting with for a moment in the dark. The boy who would later become one of the most celebrated engineers in the country first learned the trade not from a lecture hall, but from his own father's iron shield, standing in cramped, dripping cells beneath the Thames, watching a design built from the memory of a worm in a piece of dockyard timber begin to test itself against the river above. Alongside him came Richard Beamish, a young assistant engineer who joined the project in those same early years, similarly untested, similarly unknown, and similarly about to spend a great deal of his working life underground in the company of the Brunels. Neither young man had yet done anything to make his name known beyond this project. Both were about to. If your eyes are already closing, let this next part settle in gently rather than urgently, because none of it needs remembering in detail, only the shape of it. A shaft would first have to be sunk into the earth on the southern bank, straight and true, deep enough to reach the level at which the shield could begin its slow, cellular crawl beneath the river. That descent into the ground, and everything the diggers found waiting for them there, is where the story goes next. The site chosen for that shaft sat close by the river's edge at Rotherhithe, on ground the company had secured for exactly this purpose, and before a single spade of London clay came out of it, the diggers had to build the very thing that would let them dig at all. Rather than excavate an open pit and risk the loose, waterlogged ground sliding in on them before any lining could be built, Brunel's method called for the shaft to be built first as a great iron-hooped brick tower, assembled whole on the surface, standing upright like a squat, curved wall, and then allowed to sink under its own considerable weight as the earth was quietly removed from beneath it. You would have watched, had you stood at a safe distance that winter, something closer to a building lowering itself into a grave than a hole being dug in any ordinary sense, the brickwork settling by inches day after day, while men worked in the shadow beneath its rim, clearing away the ground that the whole structure's own mass was steadily displacing. It was patient work, and dangerous in a way that had nothing to do with the river yet, because the danger here came from directly overhead in several hundred tons of brick waiting only for an uneven settling to remind everyone watching exactly what it weighed. You do not need to picture the brickwork settling any further than that. Let it rest there, in the dark, sinking by its own weight, patient and enormous, and turn your attention instead to something that never had a shape you could measure at all: the ground itself, waiting under the river, indifferent to whatever was being lowered toward it. Because before there was a shaft, before there was a shield or a patent or a company formed to build any of this, there was simply the problem of not knowing. You would have felt it standing on either bank of the Thames in those years, the sense that everyone talking about tunneling under the river was talking with far more confidence than anyone actually possessed. Marc Brunel had his patent, his tunneling shield, his conviction that the thing could be done. What he did not have, what no one had, was a reliable picture of what lay between the riverbed and the tunnel he intended to drive through it. The Thames at Rotherhithe did not sit on rock the way a tunnel builder might have wished. It sat on a restless, unresolved mixture of clay and sand and waterlogged silt, laid down over centuries by a river that had never been consistent about anything, least of all what it left behind. Clay in one place might give way to running sand a few feet further along, and that sand might be saturated enough to behave less like ground and more like water that had simply forgotten to flow. You could stand at 2 points only yards apart and be standing, without knowing it, over entirely different worlds. This was not a failure of imagination on Brunel's part, or carelessness or haste. It was simply the honest limit of what the science of the age could tell anyone. Geology, as a discipline capable of reading the ground with any precision, was barely older than the men now proposing to tunnel through several hundred feet of it. The maps that existed showed rivers and roads and parish boundaries with wonderful exactness and said almost nothing reliable about what sat beneath them. If you wanted to know what was under the Thames, there was no chart you could consult, no survey already completed by someone more cautious who had come before. There was only the river itself, moving over whatever it moved over, keeping its own record in a language nobody yet knew how to read. What you could do, if you were serious about it, was go out onto the water in a boat, lower something long and narrow down through the current, and bring back whatever clung to it when it returned. This was the boring, not a bore in the sense of tedium, but a length of iron, sunk and turned and drawn up again, offering a thin core of whatever the riverbed happened to be made of at that single point, on that single day, at that single depth. It told you something true, and it told you almost nothing useful, because a few feet in any direction, the truth might change completely. Multiply that single sample by as many as patience and money allowed, plot them as best you could on a chart of the riverbed, and you had not a map so much as a series of hopeful guesses joined by faith. The engineers doing this work knew it. They were not fooling themselves, whatever the shareholders back on dry land might have preferred to believe. Every boring came up out of the water trailing more uncertainty than it resolved, because for every foot of clay it confirmed, it left the ground on either side of it as unexplained as before. You can imagine, if you like, what it must have felt like to hold one of those samples in your hand on the deck of a boat somewhere off Rotherhithe, cold, grey, faintly sour with river mud, a few ounces of stiff clay that were meant to stand in for something the size of a cathedral laid sideways under moving water. It would have felt like far too little information to build a fortune's worth of shaft and shield and brick upon, and in a sense it was. But there was no better information to be had. Not then. Not with the instruments of the day, and a project like this one was never going to wait for a science that had not yet finished inventing itself. So how then did anyone move forward on ground they understood so poorly? How do you sink a shaft and drive a tunnel through several hundred feet of unknown material and still call the decision a considered one, rather than simply a gamble dressed up in engineering language? The honest answer is that they narrowed the uncertainty as far as it would go, and then they accepted what remained of it, because the alternative was never building anything at all. The borings continued for longer than any of the men funding them would have liked. Each new sample folded into a picture that never quite resolved into confidence, only into something workable. What emerged, patchy as it was, suggested a bed of London clay lying beneath the looser material closer to the surface. Stiff, blue-grey, the kind of ground that tunnelers of the age had learned, cautiously, to trust more than most. Clay held its shape. Clay did not run. If the tunnel could be kept low enough to stay within a reasonable thickness of it, the greatest danger, the river finding its way directly into the workings, might be kept at a manageable distance, even if it could never be entirely dismissed. You should understand that this was never a guarantee, only a preference, a bet placed on the material that seemed least likely to betray them in a riverbed that had already shown every sign of being unwilling to hold still and be understood. The clay was not uniform. It thinned in places no boring had happened to strike. It sat in patches nobody could map with confidence, uncomfortably close to sand that would flow like water the moment it was disturbed, and closer still in places to the river itself, separated from open water by a roof of ground whose exact thickness nobody could state with real certainty at any given point along the line. This was the antagonist that would matter more than any rival engineer or doubting shareholder over the years to come. Not a person, not even really the river in any simple sense, but the ground itself, unresolved and unpredictable, capable of holding firm for months and then, without any warning anyone had learned to read, giving way. If your eyes are already closing, that unresolved quality is worth carrying with you into sleep rather than fighting against, the sense of a great undertaking proceeding on ground that never fully explained itself. Patient men making the best decision available to them with information that was always, at some level, incomplete. Marc Brunel understood this as well as anyone. His son, not yet out of his youth but already carrying more responsibility on this site than most engineers twice his age, understood it too, because he was the one who would spend the coming years closest to the working face, closest to whatever the ground chose to reveal about itself once the digging actually began. Between them and the surveyors whose borings had given them as much certainty as the age allowed, a decision had to be made. And it had to be made in the full knowledge that it could not be made safely in any absolute sense, only reasonably, only as well as anyone in 1825 London could reasonably expect to manage. The site chosen was Rotherhithe on the south bank, a stretch of ground surveyed as thoroughly as the borings allowed and judged, on balance, to offer the best combination of workable clay and manageable depth that the river had to offer along that reach. It was not a place chosen because the ground there was known to be safe. It was chosen because it was, as far as anyone could tell, the least unsafe option available, and that distinction, thin as it sounds, was the entire foundation on which everything that followed would be built. The shaft you have already seen settling into the earth, brick by patient brick, was sinking into ground chosen on exactly that basis, and it would not be long before the men working beneath its rim found out, in ways no boring could have warned them of, precisely how much the river still had left to teach them. What that teaching would look like, no one on the bank could yet say, and that was precisely the difficulty of standing where you would have stood, watching the first courses of brick disappear below the level of the street. You would have had no way of knowing whether the ground a few feet further down agreed with the borings taken above it, because the borings had only ever spoken for the narrow column of earth they happened to pass through. Everything outside that column remained a kind of rumour, repeated in surveyors' notebooks with more confidence than the evidence really allowed. The clay might hold. It might also, a little further along the shaft's descent, quietly give way to something wetter and less obliging, and there would be no warning bell to announce the change. Only the weight of brick pressing down, and the men inside the shaft learning what the river had decided to keep hidden until now, at whatever moment it chose to stop hiding it. You would have heard the shaft before you saw it whole, because nothing that large announces itself all at once. It comes to you in pieces. The ring of trowels against brick, the creak of timber staging, a foreman's voice pitched low so it carries without shouting. And if you had walked down to the riverbank at Rotherhithe in those months, past the timber yards and the rope walks, you would have found something that did not look like the beginning of a tunnel at all. It looked like a chimney, a vast, squat, brick chimney, standing free in a field above the river, with no purpose yet visible and no hole beneath it. That was the strangeness of it. The thing that would eventually reach beneath the Thames began its life pointed at the sky. Marc Brunel had settled on a method that unsettled almost everyone who heard it described before they saw it working. Rather than dig a shaft downward from the surface, shoring the sides as he went, the way a well digger might, he proposed to build the shaft complete first, as a solid ring of brickwork standing on the ground, and then hollow out the earth from beneath it, so that the whole immense cylinder would settle downward under nothing but its own weight. No excavated pit waiting to collapse in on itself. No walls racing to keep pace with a hole already opened beneath them. The wall would exist before the hole did, and the hole would only ever be as large as the wall allowed it to be. It was, in its way, a very calm idea, dressed up as something reckless. The tower itself was built around an iron curb, a great ring cast in sections and bolted together at the base, its underside shaped almost like a blade, so that as the brickwork above pressed down, the curb's edge would bite into the clay rather than crumble against it. Onto that ring, over weeks, the bricklayers raised a cylindrical wall 3 feet thick, layer upon layer, until it stood taller than most houses along the river and heavier, by the time it was finished, than anything else that had ever been asked to move downward through London ground under its own weight alone. You could stand at its base and feel, even before it had sunk an inch, that you were in the presence of something the river had not yet been told about. The materials came from all the ordinary places a project like this would draw from. Kilns along the Thames sending barge after barge of brick, ironworks casting the curb sections to patterns checked and rechecked by Brunel's own hand, timber merchants supplying the staging and the scaffolds that let masons work at height without simply trusting to ladders and nerve. None of it was exotic. What made it remarkable was the arrangement, not the ingredients. Ordinary brick, arranged into something that had never quite been asked to do what this brick was about to do. And then the digging began, not around the tower but beneath it, in the dark space under the iron curb, where men worked with picks and shovels in a crescent trench that never widened by more than what the tower's own edge allowed. As they cleared earth from beneath the blade of the curb, the whole structure, All that brick, all that iron, resting on nothing now but a narrowing ring of undisturbed clay, began almost imperceptibly to move. Not falling, sinking. An inch, then a little more, measured not in a single dramatic drop, but in a slow, continuous settling that the men below could feel through the soles of their boots before anyone above could see it with their eyes. It must have been an unsettling thing to stand under, and yet by every account it went as Brunel had drawn it, which is its own kind of quiet vindication for an engineer. The descent was not a single afternoon's work. It went on through weeks of digging and pause, the tower dropping a little further each time the earth beneath it was persuaded to give way, until the ground level that had once been at the tower's base was somewhere far above the heads of the men still working underneath it. If you have ever watched a heavy piece of formwork lowered slowly on a jack, resisting, then giving, then resisting again, you already know the rhythm of it, even if the scale here was larger than almost anything built before. There is nothing you need to hold on to in these details, only the shape of the thing, a tower built in air and sent down into earth, patiently, 1 inch at a time, like a nail driven not by hammer blows, but by its own accumulated weight. But who did this work? Down in that narrowing crescent of cleared earth, under 1,000 tons of brick that had no obligation to stop where they wanted it to. The names that survive belong almost entirely to the men who directed the work, rather than the men who did it. Marc Brunel drew the curb and calculated the loads. His son, still young enough that this project would define the rest of his career before he had properly begun it, spent long hours on site as resident engineer, learning in the mud and candlelight what no drawing office could teach him. But the diggers who worked in that trench beneath the sinking tower, and the bricklayers who raised its walls course by course above them, left almost no trace of themselves beyond the wage ledgers that recorded what they were paid, and occasionally an incident report noting that a man had been injured or had not come back the next day. They were, most of them, the kind of labourers London always seemed to have in surplus. Men used to digging cellars, laying drains, breaking ground for foundations, paid by the day and expected to supply their own boots. A shift underground in that period ran long, often 10 or 12 hours, broken by nothing more than a meal eaten where they stood. And the pay for it was ordinary labourers' pay, not danger money, even though everyone on site understood, in the way men understand things without saying them aloud, that this work carried a weight of risk the wage did not really account for. You do not have to remember any of their names because history mostly did not keep them either, only the fact of them, hundreds of hands moving earth in the dark beneath a settling tower, one of thousands of such crews across the city whose labour built the century and whose identities dissolved into the ledgers. If you picture one of them now, a young man perhaps, new enough to London to still find the work frightening rather than merely tedious, you are picturing something true even without a name attached to it. One of the many whose sweat is in the mortar and whose names no record kept. The shaft's sinking finished as quietly as it had begun, the tower coming to rest at last on ground firm enough to hold it, its iron curb seated in clay that had waited undisturbed since long before London existed at all. For Marc Brunel, this was the first real proof that his method worked. Not a drawing, not a model, but 50 feet of brick and iron standing exactly where he had said it would stand, sunk by a technique most engineers of his generation would have called too strange to risk. It was, by any fair measure, a victory, and it must have felt like one to the men who had watched the tower descend without a single serious failure along the way. And it was only the beginning of what the shaft made possible, because now at the bottom of that brick cylinder, in the dark and the damp and the smell of river clay, there was a floor from which the real work could start, not sinking downward any longer, but pushing sideways, out beneath the river itself, toward a shore that must have looked from where they stood, impossibly far away. But before any of that pushing could begin, the floor itself had to be made ready, and that was its own quiet labour, easy to overlook beside the drama of a tower sinking through London clay. The bottom of the shaft was lined and levelled, drains cut into it so that the groundwater seeping steadily through the brickwork below the waterline would have somewhere to go besides the boots of the men working there. A steam engine was set up above, on the ground the tower had once stood level with, its pumps running near enough continuously to keep the shaft from filling like a well, because that, in the end, was exactly what it was. A well 50 feet deep, dug beside a tidal river, and the river had no particular interest in staying out of it. What did it take to keep a hole that size dry, so close to water that rose and fell twice a day above it? More than most people imagine. The pumps ran through the night as well as the day, tended by engine men whose work is even less recorded than the diggers, men who kept boilers fed and valves greased in a shed above the shaft, while, below them, brick was being laid for the archway that would eventually carry the tunnel's mouth. If the pumps had ever failed for more than an hour or two together, the shaft would have begun filling from the bottom up, and every course of brick laid that day would have been laid for nothing. It did not fail, not yet. And with the floor dry and the archway framed, Brunel's attention turned, at last, to the wall of clay ahead of them, the river's own ground, waiting to be opened for the first time. The shield itself, when it stood assembled at the foot of the shaft, was a thing you would have needed to walk around twice before you believed what you were looking at. It was not one machine, but 12, set edge to edge like a great iron honeycomb turned on its side, each of the 12 frames divided again into 3 cells, stacked one above the other, so that 36 men could stand within it at once, each facing his own small square of undisturbed earth. You would have found it less like entering a tunnel and more like stepping inside a cupboard built for giants, every drawer occupied by a man with a spade. Marc Brunel had drawn this thing years before he ever expected to build it, taking his inspiration, so the story is told, from watching a shipworm bore through timber with a shell of its own making held always just ahead of its soft body. Whatever the truth of that account, the principle he arrived at was the same. Never let the earth stand open and unsupported, not even for a moment, not even for the width of a hand. Each miner took his cell as a soldier might take a post, and in a sense that was exactly what the arrangement resembled. Row upon row of men sealed into iron compartments, waiting for the order to begin. The face of clay in front of each man was held back by a set of horizontal boards called poling boards, wedged tight against the ground by screws that bore against the frame behind them. To work at all, a man had first to remove one board, expose a narrow strip of clay no wider than the board itself, dig that strip away to a depth of perhaps 6 inches, and then set the board back in its new position before moving to the next. It was digging measured not in barrow loads, but in inches, each one won and immediately defended, as though the ground were an opponent who would take back anything left unguarded for longer than it took to breathe. You would have heard it before you understood it, that rhythm of screw and mallet and shifted board, 36 men each a half step out of time with his neighbor, so that the sound never quite settled into a pattern your ear could hold. And beneath the sound, there would have been a smell you did not expect from clay. A thick, cold, mineral smell, faintly sweetish, that seemed to come less from the earth itself than from the river sitting in it, patient and unseen, only a few feet above the crown of the shield. There is nothing you need to do with that smell now except let it settle into the dark behind your eyes and stay there, the way it must have stayed with every man who worked that face for longer than a week. Once a full width of the shield's face had been dug forward by its narrow allowance, the entire iron structure was advanced, pressed forward on its own screws, foot by foot, into the space the digging had made. And close behind it, so close that the two operations nearly overlapped, came the bricklayers, sealing the tunnel walls in permanent brick, before the newly exposed ground had any chance to remember that it was no longer being held. Dig, brace, advance, brick. Dig, brace, advance, brick. It was a rhythm with almost no room in it for anything unplanned, and unplanned was exactly what the river sooner or later intended to be. You might wonder what it actually felt like to spend a working day inside one of those iron cells, sealed on 3 sides by frame and board, with nothing ahead of you but clay and nothing behind you but the men waiting to brick you in. It felt, by every account that survives, like work done under a held breath. The shift lasted hours that none of the miners needed clocks to measure because their bodies measured it for them, in the ache that settled into the shoulders from repeating the same short motion of spade and screw for hour after hour in a space too cramped to properly straighten in. There was no daylight down there to mark the shift's end, only the sound of the man relieving you arriving at the ladder and the walk back up through brick and timber toward air that, however foul the shaft itself might be, still felt like a mercy after the cell. One of the miners who worked that face, his name, like most of the names on that payroll, was never thought worth recording by the men who kept the accounts, was, by the description passed down of men in his trade, typical of dozens who came to the works from Cornwall's mining country, men who already knew what it meant to labor beneath ground that wanted, in its own slow way, to close back over them. He would have known the particular fear of water before most Londoners ever gave it a thought, because he had likely felt it before, dripping through a Cornish shaft roof or rising suddenly around his boots in a level that should have stayed dry. Whatever his name, he stood for the whole class of men who brought that underground instinct with them to the Thames, and who understood, better than any engineer's drawing could explain it, exactly how much weight was sitting quietly over their heads. That weight was never spoken of directly, not in any note or ledger that survives, and yet it shaped everything about how the men moved. You would have noticed it in the way conversation inside the shield tended to stay low and practical. Questions about a board's fit or a screw's turn, and almost nothing wasted on subjects that might have let a man's mind wander upward through the clay to the river running above him. It is a very old kind of discipline, the discipline of men who agree, without ever saying so, not to speak of the thing they are all thinking about. If you have ever lain awake in a dark room, turning over a worry you refuse to name even to yourself, you already understand the shape of it, though the men under the Thames had considerably more reason for theirs than most worries ever earn. But how does a project like this get watched over closely enough to survive its own daily risks? And who is left to notice when the pace begins to slow or the ground begins to behave differently than it did the week before? That task fell increasingly to two men, one already well known to the works and one who had not been part of its story from the very beginning. Isambard Brunel, Marc's son, had been given real responsibility on the project by this stage, and he did not treat that responsibility as something to be discharged from a drawing office above ground. He went down the shaft as often as the work required it, which in practice meant most days, and there are records enough to say plainly that he spent hours inside the shield itself, in among the cells, watching the boards come out and go back, occasionally taking a spade or a screw key into his own hands rather than simply directing the men who held them. You would have found it unusual, if you had stood there yourself, to see an engineer of his position crouched shoulder to shoulder with a miner in a space built for one man and barely tolerating two. But by every surviving account, that is precisely where he chose to be. It earned him something from the workforce that no drawing, however careful, could have earned on its own. The sense that whoever was asking them to trust the ground had at least been willing to trust it himself, in the same cramped inches they trusted it in every day. Alongside him, keeping the record that history would later lean on rather heavily, was Richard Beamish, a young engineer who had joined the works and who took it upon himself to note, with a diarist's patience, how far the shield advanced from week to week, how the ground behaved as it was opened, and how the mood of the men shifted as conditions changed beneath them. It is largely through Beamish's account that later engineers have been able to reconstruct the pace of that advance at all, a pace that was, by his own careful figures, agonizingly slow when set against the size of the task still ahead, sometimes no more than a few feet gained across an entire week of continuous labor. He recorded it without embellishment, the way a man records a tide table, because for the works under his eye, that was essentially what the shield's progress was. A slow, watched, faintly anxious measurement of how much ground had been claimed back from the river since the last time anyone had thought to check. If your eyes have already begun to close somewhere in the last few minutes, that is exactly the right thing for them to do, because nothing that has been said here needs to be carried forward on purpose. The shield will keep advancing whether you hold the details or let them go foot by foot, board by board, with Isambard somewhere in the cells and Beamish somewhere above with his notebook, and the river sitting exactly where it has always sat, waiting to see whether the clay above the frames would hold as steadily as the men inside them hoped it would. There is a particular sound a tunnel makes in the moment just before the river decides to come in, and every man working the shield that spring would learn it, though none of them ever described it quite the same way afterward. Some called it a hiss, others called it a kind of sigh, as if the ground itself had finally let out a breath it had been holding since the excavation began. You would have felt it before you heard it. A coldness pressed suddenly against your cheek in a place where the air had been merely damp a moment before, and then almost lazily a trickle finding the seam between two boards. It did not stay a trickle for long. In the cell nearest the crown, where a miner was easing away at the face with the small care the work demanded, the trickle became a jet, and the jet became, within what felt to every man present, like no time at all, a wall of grey river water forcing itself through the gap where clay should have been packed tight and was not. The frame groaned. The boards behind it bowed. Men shouted down the line, one cell to the next, and you can imagine what that shout would have done to a body already working in near darkness, with its boots half sunk in mud, though nobody down there needed to imagine anything at all. The shield's whole design rested on a simple promise, that each of its cells could be sealed off from its neighbors the moment trouble came, so that a failure in one place would not become a failure everywhere. That promise held, mostly, in those first frantic minutes. Men in the cells to either side dropped their tools and threw themselves against the boards that separated them from the flood, holding weight against water with nothing but their own backs and the board's own stubbornness, while somewhere behind them a voice was already calling for clay. Above, on the surface, the response came almost as quickly as the crisis itself, though from where you would have stood in the flooded cell it must have felt like the longest wait of your life. Word passed up the shaft in the fastest way anyone had, which is to say a man climbing as fast as his legs would carry him, and within the hour barges on the river were being loaded with sacks, and clay was being lowered down in baskets to be packed by hand into the exact breach the shield's own men were pointing to from below. It is one of the stranger images this tunnel gives us, if you sit with it a moment. A hole in the bed of the busiest river in the kingdom, and ordinary Londoners on the surface tipping clay into the water above it, aiming for a target they could not see, guided only by shouted instruction, relayed man to man down a shaft none of them could enter. The breach was sealed before it swallowed the works entirely, though it came close enough that everyone involved understood exactly how close. Sandbags went in after the clay to hold it against the current, and for a day or more the shield stood still while men waited to see whether the plug would take the river's pressure or simply be shouldered aside the moment work resumed. It held. The water in the flooded cell was baled and pumped until the floor was mud again instead of a pond, and the frame that had bowed was checked and found, to everyone's quiet relief, to have bowed and not broken. You would think that would be the end of it. A frightening morning followed by a return to routine, and in the strictest sense that is what happened. The shield moved again within days, but something had changed in the tunnel that could not be pumped out along with the water, and it is worth sitting with what that change actually was before the story moves on, because it did not belong to the ground at all. It belonged to the men. What does fear actually do to a workforce that has no choice but to keep working? It does not empty the tunnel, not at first, and that alone tells you something about the wages on offer and the alternatives waiting outside them. But it changes who walks down the shaft each morning and how they walk. Some men simply did not come back. There is no cruelty in saying so, and no surprise in it either. They had watched the river reach for them once and had no wish to give it a second chance, and they went back to whatever trade had fed them before the tunnel offered better money for worse odds. Nobody recorded their names because nobody thought to, which is true of nearly everyone who worked that shield in those years. They exist in the record only as a gap in the muster roll, a thinning of the crew that the company's clerks noted with more concern for the schedule than for the men themselves. Others stayed, and it is worth asking honestly why rather than dressing it up as courage, because for most of them it was not courage in any grand sense. It was arithmetic. A day's wage below the river was a day's wage a family upstairs was waiting on, and the alternative trades open to a labourer in that part of London paid less and offered no more safety in the bargain, only a different, slower kind of danger. The young miner who had already told you once in an earlier moment of this story that he did not care for the sound the river made through the boards was among those who came back down the shaft the following week. He had a wife waiting on his wage and no particular fondness for hunger either, and between those two facts, the choice more or less made itself. He was one of hundreds who left no other trace of that choice than the fact of turning up again. If you have already begun to drift somewhere in this last stretch, let yourself keep drifting. None of this needs to be held onto, only felt the way the men themselves must have felt it, as a mood that settled over the tunnel rather than a fact anyone wrote down in full. What the fear did produce, in writing at least, was Richard Beamish's account of the days that followed, and it is worth pausing on because it gives you something closer than any diagram to what the tunnel actually felt like in that aftermath. He described an atmosphere among the men that had shifted from the ordinary grim good humor of dangerous work into something quieter and more watchful. Men glancing toward the crown of the tunnel as they worked, listening for a hiss that might or might not come. Doing their jobs with the particular carefulness of people who have recently been reminded in the plainest possible terms that the ground above their heads is not solid so much as merely patient. And it was into that atmosphere that Isambard placed himself more than once, in ways the record is specific enough about that they do not need any embellishing. During this breach and during another that followed it before long, he was among those who went into the flooded and half-flooded workings himself, rather than directing the response from the shaft head, working alongside the men who might reasonably have expected their engineer to stay dry while they did the wading. It was not the last time he would do this, and it would not be the last time it cost him something. But even here, in this first serious failure of the shield, you can already see the shape of a man who did not seem to believe that risk belonged only to other people. The work paused. Not for long, not in the sense of weeks, but long enough that everyone connected with the company understood the shield's first serious test had come and had not been a clean success, only a survival, and there is a difference between the two that no amount of pumped water could disguise. The frames had held, mostly, the clay plug had held, but the confidence that had carried the project this far, the quiet certainty that the design itself was sound and only the details remained to be worked out, had taken a blow that would not be easily repaired, and the men who returned to the cells in the days after did so knowing something they had not quite known before, which was that the river was not simply an obstacle to be tunneled under, but an opponent that had already shown its hand once and would, in its own time and without any warning anyone could rely upon, show it again. What that hand had shown was not lost on the men who kept the ledgers either, and it is worth turning to them for a moment because fear was not the only thing the breach had loosened. Somewhere above, in an office that never once saw the mud the shield's men waded through, a director was already totting up the cost of clay bought in a hurry, of sandbags, of the days the shield stood idle while the plug was tested, and finding the sum considerably larger than anyone had allowed for. You would not have heard that arithmetic from below the river, but it was being done all the same, quietly, in a different kind of darkness, and it would reach the tunnel soon enough in its own way. The company's offices stood well away from the river, in rooms with carpets and clean paper, and it is worth picturing them for a moment because the story of the tunnel now runs through those rooms as much as through the shaft. You would have found no mud there, no lantern smoke staining the ceiling, only ledgers laid open on a long table and men in good coats bent over columns of figures that did not want to add up kindly. Every yard the shield had advanced now had a price attached to it that nobody had quite predicted at the start, and every setback the men below had shrugged off as simply part of the work had, up here, turned into a line item that would not go away. The clay bought in haste after the breach, the extra shifts. The brickwork rushed in to close the wound in the riverbed before the Thames found it again. None of it had been cheap, and all of it had landed on a company whose funds had been raised on the promise of a tunnel finished in a matter of a few short years, not one still fighting the river with no clear end in sight. You do not need to understand a balance sheet to understand what was happening to this one. Money that should have carried the work forward for the next 12 months was instead accounting for damage already done, and each new setback below ground had begun to translate almost immediately into fresh anxiety above it. The directors met more often than they once had. Their meetings ran longer, and increasingly the subject was not how quickly the shield might reach the far shore, but whether the company could afford to keep it moving at all. But where does the money for a hole under a river even come from in the first place? And what happens to the people who supplied it once the hole stops being a promising investment and starts being a liability that keeps eating its own capital? That is worth pausing on, because it explains everything that follows. The tunnel had been funded the way most great and uncertain works of that age were funded, by subscription, by shareholders who had bought into the idea of it as much as into any technical certainty of its completion, drawn by talk of a crossing that would change the trade of the river forever. Investors who buy into an idea are, by nature, investors who can just as easily fall out of love with one. And by this point in the work, the idea had stopped feeling like a triumph waiting to happen and had started to feel like a wound that kept reopening. Each demand for further capital was harder to meet than the last. Shareholders who had once spoken proudly of their stake in Mr. Brunel's tunnel now spoke of it, if they spoke of it at all, with the particular embarrassment of people who suspect they have backed something that will outlive their patience. The newspapers naturally noticed. You would not have had to search hard for an opinion on the tunnel in those years. It seemed to invite one from everybody, whether or not they had ever set foot near the shaft. Some papers wrote of the enterprise the way they might have written of a fine piece of theatre that had simply run too long, admiring the ambition, growing weary of the weight. Others were less generous, and printed doubt is a durable thing. Once a paper had suggested the tunnel might never be finished, that suggestion sat in front of the public for as long as anyone cared to remember it, long after the article itself had been used to wrap something in a shop. There were letters to editors from men who had never been within a mile of the river debating with total confidence whether the whole scheme had been folly from the start. It is a strange thing, if you think about it, how much of the pressure on a project like this one comes not from the ground it is being built through, but from rooms and pages that have nothing to do with the ground at all. The river did not know it was being doubted. The clay did not care what the papers said. But money does care, and money listens to newspapers far more readily than it listens to engineers. And so the doubt printed in ink began to matter to the tunnel almost as much as the doubt printed in cracked brick. It reached the point eventually where the halt was not a rumor discussed in offices, but a fact discussed in the tunnel itself. Work slowed, then it slowed further. There is a particular quiet that settles over a working shaft when the men down in it start to sense, before anyone tells them outright, that the money behind their wages is running thin. A caution in how the shift foremen speak, a wariness in how supplies are counted out, the small tells of an operation that has begun bracing itself. You would have felt it if you had gone down in those weeks, that faint unease under the ordinary noise of the work, the sense of men doing a job they were no longer certain would still be there to finish. And then, in due course, it simply stopped. The shield stood where it had been left. The ladders and the lamps stayed where they were. The great iron frame that had been carrying men forward through the clay, one small advance at a time, held its place in the dark and did not move again for what would turn into years rather than months. If your eyes are already closed, let this next part settle over you slowly, because there is no urgency in it at all. This is simply what waiting looked like, stretched out far longer than anyone above or below the river had ever intended. It is worth turning now to the man whose name was, by this point, inseparable from the tunnel, because the halt did not only cost the company money, it cost Marc Brunel something considerably harder to recover. He had staked the better part of his reputation, and no small part of his health, on a piece of ground running the width of the river, and for a long stretch of years that ground now amounted to little more than a stalled shaft, a silent shield, and a public account of the enterprise that had turned, in many quarters, faintly mocking. You could hardly walk past certain coffee houses without hearing his tunnel spoken of as a folly, a hole that swallowed money the way the river had twice threatened to swallow the men working it. For an engineer who had built his standing over decades on careful, patented ingenuity, this was a particular kind of wound, not physical, not sudden, but slow and public and impossible to escape. He wrote in these years of the strain of it, of nights spent turning the problem over with no fresh capital in hand to act on any solution he found. His son, still young, still learning the trade in the tightest and most literal sense inside that same shaft, watched his father carry a reputation that the tunnel itself seemed determined for the time being to refuse to redeem. And so began the interval that the tunnel's own history rarely lingers on because it offers no drama to speak of, only duration. The shield sat where the work had left it, its iron frame slowly losing the warmth of use, the timber staging around it settling into stillness. Down in the shaft, water crept in where the pumps ran less often than they once had, and silence gathered in a place that had, for what felt like a long season of a man's working life, never been silent at all. You would have heard, if you had gone down there in that time, only the drip of water finding its own way, and perhaps the occasional watchman's boot on wet brick, checking that nothing worse than stillness had taken hold. Years passed this way, not months. Years in which the shield did not advance a single foot, in which the company searched for money it could not easily find, and in which the tunnel existed less as a work in progress than as a question the city had not yet decided how to answer. It would not stay that way forever. Somewhere in those quiet years, patience, obstinacy, and a fresh piece of persuasion were already gathering themselves toward another beginning, and the shaft that had gone silent would not remain silent for good. What moved first was not the shaft, but a committee, one of those quiet gatherings of men who had not been near the river in years, but who still held its future somewhere in their ledgers. They came back to the tunnel the way a person returns to a debt they had hoped to forget, drawn less by faith than by the discomfort of walking away from so much already spent. A new case had to be made, and making it meant returning to the very numbers that had frightened everyone off in the first place, turning them over until they looked less like a wound and more like an investment merely paused. There were letters exchanged, meetings arranged, old doubts revisited by men who had grown a little more desperate and perhaps a little more willing to listen. Marc Brunel, still standing by the thing he had staked his name on, would have to make that case in person before anyone agreed to send water back down the shaft's pumps for the sake of starting again. Marc Brunel, still standing by the thing he had staked his name on, would have to make that case in person before anyone agreed to send water back down the shaft's pumps for the sake of starting again. You can imagine him in that room, though no one recorded exactly which room it was, a man past 60, his hearing already going, laying drawings across a table for officials who had read the newspapers and remembered the word flood before they remembered anything else about the tunnel. He had built a case out of arithmetic before, and arithmetic was what he brought again. The distance already driven under the river, the shield still standing where the water had left it, the cost of finishing measured against the far greater cost of walking away from a hole in the ground that led nowhere and proved nothing. It was not a case that moved quickly. Years passed with the tunnel simply waiting, its brick lining sealed against a river that had already shown twice what it could do, the shaft dry only because no one had reason to fill it. If you had stood at the top of that shaft during those years, you would have heard nothing at all. No shield creaking forward, no picks against clay, only wind across an opening that led down into a silence nobody was paying to break. What eventually loosened the money was not sentiment. It was the intervention of men whose names carried weight in rooms where Marc Brunel's alone did not, among them the Duke of Wellington, a subscriber to the company and no stranger to unfinished campaigns, who lent his support to a treasury loan that would let the work resume without asking private investors to risk anything further of their own. A government loan changes the character of a project in ways that are hard to see from the outside, but easy to feel from within it. The tunnel was no longer only a private gamble that had gone wrong twice. It was now, in some small official sense, a public undertaking, watched by people who answered to other people, who would want to know, in language plainer than an engineer usually chooses, why progress was slow and what exactly the money was buying. That scrutiny would follow the work below the river for the rest of its length, and you can hear it in the way the surviving reports of these years read, more cautious, more careful to explain, as though every foot gained now had to be accounted for twice, once in the ledger and once in the reputation of everyone whose name sat near the project. The pumps went back to work, and the water that had stood in the workings for years was drawn off slowly, the way it always had to be, so as not to disturb ground that had spent a long time settling into its own quiet arrangement with the river above it. There is something almost tender in the image, if you let yourself sit with it a moment. A flooded, abandoned working, sealed and forgotten by everyone except the handful of men whose job it was to remember it, being coaxed back into dryness so that human beings could once again walk into a space the Thames had twice tried to reclaim. If your eyes are already drifting as you listen to this, that is exactly the right frame of mind for it. Nothing here needs to be held onto, only felt the way the men themselves must have felt, some private unease returning to a shaft that had already taken lives and swallowed money twice over. Beamish, whose diary had carried the story faithfully through the earlier collapse, was still attached to the works when they resumed, still recording what he saw with the same plain, unhurried hand, a witness who had not left even when the project itself had, for years, gone nowhere. But could the company simply pick up where it had left off, as though nothing had happened underneath the river? Nobody involved believed that, least of all the men who would be doing the digging. The method that returned to the tunnel face was not quite the method that had left it. Where the shield had once been driven forward with something closer to urgency, weeks measured against the patience of investors who wanted to see distance covered, the pace now was different, slower, more deliberate. Each foot of advance treated less as a milestone and more as a small negotiation with a river that had already demonstrated twice exactly what it would do if given the chance. The frames of the shield were inspected more often. The boarding ahead of each cell, the timber and iron that held back the ground before the miners cut into it, was set and checked with a patience that had not always been affordable in the years before the flood, when every week of delay was a week the subscribers could see draining their investment away. Now delay was, in its own strange way, cheaper than disaster. Everyone underground understood that a third flood would very likely be the tunnel's last. You would have noticed the difference immediately if you had worked both periods, though of course almost nobody had, a slower rhythm to the work, a foreman more willing to stop the face entirely when the ground ahead felt wrong to the hand or sounded wrong under a testing rod, a general unwillingness to let ambition outrun caution the way it plainly had before. Isambard Brunel, whose body had carried the visible cost of the first breach and who had spent months recovering from injuries that very nearly ended his own working life, was now more central to the daily running of the tunnel than he had been in its earlier years. His father remained the tunnel's engineer of record, the mind whose patent and whose reputation the whole enterprise still rested on. But it was increasingly Isambard's presence at the face, his inspections of the shield's frames and his notes on the state of the ground, that shaped how each day's advance actually proceeded. He had nearly drowned under this river once. That fact does not seem to have made him leave it. If anything, the men working the frames alongside him during these years describe someone who had become more careful rather than less committed, a young engineer who had learned exactly what the Thames was capable of and adjusted his habits accordingly, without ever quite losing the appetite that had put him there in the first place. Beamish continued through these months as he had through the earlier ones, less a name attached to any single decision than a steady presence recording what the tunnel did day by day in a manner unhurried enough that his account still reads, all these years later, like someone speaking quietly across a table rather than shouting from a distance. It is through accounts like his that anyone now knows how slow this second beginning truly was, not measured in the confident weekly reports the company might once have issued to reassure its subscribers, but in the smaller, more honest currency of feet gained against feet lost. Frames advanced against frames that had to be reset when the ground ahead proved softer or wetter than expected. There is no drama in most of these entries. There is only the sense of a project being carried forward by people who had already been frightened badly enough to be careful, inching beneath a river that had not changed its habits at all, only its opponent's understanding of them. The tunnel crept forward in these years the way a tide comes in. If you have ever stood and watched one, not in any single visible motion, but in a slow accumulation that only becomes obvious once you compare where the water's edge stood an hour before. Foot followed foot beneath the silt and the gravel and the black anonymous clay that made up the riverbed above the shield, each one at a pace that would have seemed intolerably slow to the company's earliest investors, and now seemed to everyone actually underground, like exactly the speed such ground deserved. The company's credibility was staked on this slow arithmetic as surely as its money was. There had already been 2 disasters and 2 lengthy silences. A third would very likely have ended the tunnel for good, left as an expensive, half-finished scar under the river for someone else's generation to argue about. And so, the work went on, quietly, carefully, without the fanfare that had attended its earliest months, advancing toward a river crossing that remained, foot by foot, still a very long way from finished and toward hazards under that riverbed that had nothing to do with water at all, and everything to do with the air the men themselves were forced to breathe. That air was not something anyone had planned for. The shield's cast-iron cells kept the river out well enough by now, but they also kept in whatever the ground itself was breathing out. A foul, close staleness that thickened the deeper the miners cut, made worse by the lamps that burned to let them see at all. A man could work an hour at the face and come away with a headache that lasted the rest of his shift, though no one thought to write that down as anything unusual. It was simply what the tunnel felt like now, this far in, this far under. Beamish noted the candles guttering strangely on certain days, burning low and blue, though it would be a while yet before anyone understood exactly why. You would not have needed to be told the air was bad. You would have felt it in the first few yards past the shaft, a change in the weight of what you were breathing, as though someone had draped a wet cloth over your mouth without asking. Further in, past the working face where the shield stood locked into the clay, the feeling only deepened. It settled behind your eyes. It sat on your chest. Richard Beamish, who kept the tunnel's daily record with the patience of a man who expected history to ask him questions later, wrote of headaches that came on within the hour and did not lift until a man had been above ground for some time. And he wrote of them so often in such an unremarkable tone that you can tell they had stopped being news to anyone working there. That, more than any single figure he set down, tells you what the tunnel had become by this stage of its life. Not a site of catastrophe most days, a site of slow cost. The trouble had 2 parents, and neither of them announced itself with any drama. The first was simply depth and distance. Air does not travel through a bricked tube on its own. It has to be pushed or drawn, and in a work as long and as narrow as this one, with only the shaft behind you and the face somewhere ahead in the dark, there was no current to speak of. Whatever a man breathed out stayed close to where he breathed it. Whatever the lamps burned off, and there were dozens of lamps guttering along that brickwork at any given hour, stayed there too, thinning the little good air that remained. You would have noticed, if you had stood at the face for any length of time, that the flame nearest you burned differently from the one you remembered from the surface. Lower, bluer at the edges, less willing to throw real light. Nobody down there had the chemistry to explain that properly. They simply learned, the way men learn anything dangerous without the words for it, that a flame behaving strangely meant something in the air had changed, and that the change was rarely for the better. The second parent of the trouble came up out of the river itself, and this was the part that made men genuinely afraid, in a way that headaches alone never quite did. The Thames above them was not the river you might imagine on a clean morning with the light on it. It was the drain of a city that had not yet built itself a sewer system worth the name, carrying off whatever London poured into it, and that water found its way down through the ground and into the workings in ways no one could fully seal against. It came as seepage, as damp patches on the clay that widened without warning, sometimes as a thin trickle that a man could put his boot in without thinking twice, until the smell reached him, and he understood exactly what he was standing in. Men who spent their days breathing air thickened by lamp smoke and thinned by depth, and who worked ankle-deep in water carrying the waste of a whole city, began falling sick in a pattern too steady to be coincidence, even if no one in the 1830s had the means to prove the connection the way you or I might now. Fevers moved through the workforce. Men who had been strong at the start of a week were pulled off the shift by the middle of it, sweating and shaking in the cramped huts near the shaft head, and some of them did not come back to work at all. There was no single day when this became the story of the tunnel. It became the story slowly, the way damp gets into a house, one man missing, then another, then a foreman noting that the crew was short again and no one quite remarking on why. If you had walked the length of the workings during these years, lantern in hand, what would actually have reached you before you saw any of it? The smell would have come first, always the smell. River damp and lamp oil and something fouler underneath both. A smell the miners themselves stopped mentioning because there was no use in mentioning it. Then the sound, low and constant, of picks somewhere ahead, and the cough of a man who had been down too many hours running together. And then, if your eyes had adjusted, you would have seen how tired everyone looked in a way that went beyond one bad night's sleep. The particular grey exhaustion of men whose bodies were being spent a little at a time with nothing sudden enough to write home about. There is nothing you need to hold on to from any of this. If your eyes have already begun to close, let them. This stretch of the story is not one that asks to be remembered in detail, only felt as the ground beneath everything that came after. But foul air alone does not explain the fires. And there were fires, not often. Not the great collapse everyone half expected after the flood that had already struck the workings once, but small, sudden ignitions that added themselves to the long list of things a miner in that tunnel simply had to accept as part of the wage. What was actually catching down there in the dark, and why would something as ordinary as a candle have set it off? The answer, as best as it was understood at the time, lay in the same foul air that gave men their headaches, marsh gas, the same breath of decay that rises from stagnant ground anywhere, from ditches and old drains, and the kind of waterlogged clay the tunnel was being driven through, collected in pockets where the ventilation was weakest, in the low corners, and behind the brickwork where no current of air ever reached to disturb it. Nobody down there called it methane. They simply called it foul air, or bad air, or sometimes nothing at all, because a man does not always stop to name the thing that is about to catch light around him. And catch light it did on occasion, when a candle flame met a pocket of it in some poorly aired stretch of the workings. The result was rarely the roaring blaze you might picture. More often it was a soft, sudden flare, gone as quickly as it came, singeing a man's sleeve or his eyebrows, filling the confined space with a fresh wave of smoke that made the bad air worse before anyone could clear it. Beamish recorded these small fires much as he recorded the fevers, as incidents, not disasters, worth a line in the log and then the work resumed. You get the sense, reading between what he set down, that after the flood, the workforce measured every new danger against that one, and most things came up smaller by comparison, even when they should not have. That is, in many ways, the truest description of this whole stretch of the tunnel's life. It was the grinding middle of the work, the part with no single date anyone remembers now, the years between the flood that nearly ended everything and whatever finally let the men break through to daylight. There is no single dramatic night to set the scene here, no wall of water crashing through timber, no headline for a Sunday paper. There was, instead, a long procession of ordinary shifts, each one shortening a few more men's strength, each one carrying its small, survivable dose of bad air and worse water, its occasional flare of gas catching on an open flame, its cough that would not quite clear by morning. If you had been one of the men going down that shaft day after day through this period, you would not have thought of yourself as living through history. You would have thought of yourself as getting through the week, the way anyone does whose work is dangerous but familiar, the danger folded so deeply into the routine that it stopped registering as danger at all. And yet the toll was real, however quietly it accumulated. And it is worth sitting with for a moment before the story moves on, because it was about to be interrupted again. And this time not by fever or flame, but by the river itself, patient and unhurried, finding its way back down through the ground exactly where the miners least expected it. in a moment that would once more turn every complaint about bad air and blue candlelight into something men would have gladly traded for. There was, among the men who came back to the shaft head week after week, a young rigger whose name no ledger troubled to keep, one of hundreds whose names no record kept, though Beamish's pages hint at someone very like him, a man trusted with the ropes and the pulleys at the working face, who by this stage had spent enough winters underground to read the tunnel the way a sailor reads weather. He was the one, other workers later recalled through Beamish's account, who first noticed that a certain patch of clay near the river's deepest point had begun to sweat in a way the older seepage never had, a darker damp spreading a little further each shift. He said nothing to the engineers at first. There was, after all, always damp somewhere in that tunnel. But he began quietly to keep his own eye on that stretch of wall, the way a man watches a sky he does not yet trust. The damp did not stay patient for long. Within the space of a few shifts, the dark patch he had been watching had spread from something the width of a hand to something the width of a door, and the seep that came through it had changed its character too. No longer the slow weeping that every tunnelman learned to live with, but something with a faint hiss in it, as though the river above were leaning its whole weight against a wall that had never been asked to hold so much back. You would have felt it before you understood it, if you had been standing near that face that morning. A coldness in the air that had nothing to do with the season. A smell of the river itself, silty and faintly metallic, arriving ahead of the water as if to announce it. There is nothing you need to hold on to in what comes next. It happened quickly, and it happened to men whose names, where they survive at all, survive only in a handful of company ledgers and newspaper columns, and the story asks only that you sit with it gently, the way you might sit with any old grief that is no longer sharp but has never quite closed. The burst, when it came with a force that dwarfed the flooding the tunnel had already survived once before. Those earlier breaches had been bad enough, walls of water knee-deep and rising, men scrambling for the stairs in the dark. Brunel himself once carried half-drowned to the surface in the arms of his workers. But this was different in scale and in temper. Witnesses who survived it described the river coming through not as a leak widening into a flood, but as something closer to a door being torn from its frame, a great collapsing rush that filled the lower workings almost before the alarm bell had finished its first stroke. The shield, that great iron frame of chambers in which the miners worked, became in an instant a series of small drowning rooms, each man in his cell hearing the water arrive before he could see it, in the confined dark where a lantern showed you perhaps an arm's length in any direction. What saved as many as it did was the thing the tunnel had been quietly building into its own bones for years by that point. A chain of command that had been drilled, half by design and half by bitter experience, into every man who went down the shaft. The overmen shouted the retreat almost as one voice. Ladders that had stood ready against just this possibility took the weight of dozens of men at once, and the shaft itself, that long brick throat rising up toward the ordinary daylight of Rotherhithe, became for a few minutes the entire world, crowded with bodies climbing over each other in the wet dark, every man's hands finding the rungs by memory rather than sight. If you had been standing at the top of that shaft, looking down, you would have seen only a moving column of black shapes rising out of black water, and heard, over the general roar of the flood below, individual voices calling names that were not being answered. Most of the men reached the top. That has to be said plainly and gratefully, because it is the truth, and because the tunnel's survival at all depended on the fact that a well-drilled workforce, however frightened, generally does what it has been trained to do. But not all of them reached it in time. Several men who had been furthest into the workings when the water came, deepest under the river, furthest from the ladders, caught perhaps by a fallen prop or simply by the arithmetic of distance and current, did not come up again with the others. Their loss was recorded afterward in the same flat, careful language the company used for every accident: names, dates, sometimes an address, occasionally a widow's claim for compensation that the ledgers show being paid, grudgingly or generously, depending on the year and the temper of the board. There was no spectacle made of it at the time, no lingering account of the moment the water reached them. The record simply closes the door on them, the way the tunnel itself closed over that stretch of workings for a while afterward, and leaves you standing at the edge of a silence you cannot quite see into. The miner who had watched the wall, the one who had noticed the sweating clay before anyone else thought to look at it, was among those who came up. Later, by the accounts that survive of the days that followed, he did not speak much of what he had seen below before the alarm, only that he had known, in the particular way a man who has spent years underground comes to know such things, that the wall he had been watching would not hold much longer. Whether his warnings ever reached the engineers in time to matter, no surviving record says for certain, and it would be a kindness to the truth, and to him, not to invent an answer where none exists. But what was Brunel doing in all of this? The son, the young engineer whose name would in time eclipse even his father's on this project. That is worth turning to now, because his presence in the crisis was not incidental, and what it cost him did not end when the water finally stopped rising. Isambard Brunel was, by every account that survives, in the workings again when this second and greater flood broke through, much as he had been present at the earlier one that nearly killed him. He was still a young man in these years, already carrying himself with the restless, driven energy that would define his whole career, and he seems to have regarded his own safety as a secondary consideration to the safety of the tunnel and the men inside it. He was among those who helped organize the retreat up the shaft, by some accounts remaining below longer than caution would have advised, making sure the ladders were clear and the stragglers accounted for before he climbed himself. It is the kind of detail that could easily be embroidered into heroism. And the story does not need embroidering to be worth telling plainly. A young engineer, not yet secure in his reputation, standing in rising water because the men under his direction were still down there too. The cost of that repeated exposure, to the water, to the foul air that followed every flood as the workings tried to breathe again, to the sheer physical and nervous strain of crisis after crisis in a tunnel that seemed determined to test every assumption made about it, showed itself in Brunel's health for a long while afterward. He is recorded as having suffered a serious injury connected to this period of the tunnel's history, and the recovery took him away from the works for a considerable stretch, sent by doctors to recuperate in gentler air far from the river he had so nearly drowned in more than once. You do not have to remember the details of his convalescence to feel the shape of it. A young man built for motion and argument and long nights over drawings, forced instead into stillness, listening from a distance for news of a tunnel that kept almost killing him and that he could not quite bring himself to leave alone. News of the flood when it reached the wider city did what news of the first flood had already done, only more so. The company's shareholders, who had watched their investment vanish into mud and water and endless requests for further capital, asked again the question that never seemed to find a permanent answer. Was this tunnel, however remarkable its ambition, worth what it kept demanding in bodies and money both? Newspapers weighed in with the same mixture of admiration and doubt they always brought to the project, praising the courage of the men while questioning the judgment of those who kept sending them back down. The city above went on with its ordinary business, its wagons and its markets and its river traffic, largely unaware that beneath its feet a small, drenched, exhausted workforce was once again counting who had come up and who had not. And so the tunnel sat, for a time, in that peculiar suspended state it had visited before, flooded, silent, its fate once more a matter of argument in boardrooms rather than progress underground. What would be done with those ruined workings and whether anyone would ever be persuaded to go back into them was a question that would take its own slow time to answer in the quiet weeks that followed while the water was pumped out and the mud settled and the tunnel waited, patient as it had always been, to see whether it would be allowed to continue at all. The pumps that were brought in to clear the lower workings ran for days on end, their steady thud becoming the only sound down at the shaft head, a heartbeat standing in for all the ordinary noise of picks and shovels that had gone quiet. Slowly, the water level fell inch by inch, and with it came the slow uncovering of what the flood had left behind. Tools abandoned mid-task, a lantern still hanging from its hook, the mud-choked frame of the shield itself, waiting to see whether anyone would trust it enough to climb back inside. You would have needed a lantern to see any of it clearly, because the gallery had gone dark in every sense that mattered. and what little light reached down from the shaft above fell in a narrow grey column that lit nothing but the dust it stirred. The pumps kept their work going long after the visible water was gone, drawing out what had seeped into the clay itself, into every seam and joint the river had found on its way through. Marc Brunel came down more than once during these weeks, moving slowly along planking laid over mud that had not yet decided whether it would hold a man's weight. And he wrote what he saw in the plain, careful hand he kept for bad news. The shield had not been swept away. That much was fixed almost at once, and it mattered more than anything else that could be reported that week, because a lost shield would have meant starting the whole design over, and there was no appetite left in London for starting anything over. What the water had done instead was quieter, and, in its way, more troubling. Silt had packed itself into the mechanism at every point where iron met iron, and the great frames that should have moved freely under the pressure of the jacks now sat locked in place, as though the river had reached inside the machine and simply held it still. Men went in with rags and scrapers to work the mud out of the joints by hand, in a space too low to stand in and too dark to see the far end of, and you would have felt the cold of that clay through your knees within minutes of kneeling in it. It was slow, unglamorous work, the kind that never gets painted or engraved, and it fell mostly to men who had already lost friends to the tunnel and had every reason to want no part of it. That so many stayed is one of the plainer facts of this whole story and one of the easier to overlook. Assessing what remained usable meant going cell by cell through the shield's 12 compartments, checking the timber staging inside each one, testing whether the iron plating at the face had buckled or simply been battered. Some had to be replaced outright. Others were judged sound enough to serve a little longer, on the understanding that a little longer was all anyone was promising now. There is a particular kind of patience required for this sort of inspection, the patience of a person going through a house after a fire, deciding what can still be trusted and what only looks like it can, and if you have ever done that kind of work yourself, you will know how it settles into your hands long before it settles into your mind. Nobody down there was thinking about wonder or history in those weeks. They were thinking about the next joint, the next timber, the next foot of cleared passage, and whether the water would decide to come back before they were ready for it. Confidence, once broken, does not return because a foreman announces that the danger has passed. It returns, if it returns at all, in small increments, each one earned by nothing going wrong for one more day. Word of the flood had already spread well beyond the works themselves, out along the wharves and into the coffee houses where men talked over the newspapers, and it meant that hiring became its own kind of struggle in the weeks after the water was cleared. Some of the miners who had worked the face before the flood did not come back, and no one recorded blame against them for it. A man who has felt a river close over his head has told you something true about the value he places on the next payment of wages. New hands had to be found to replace them, drawn from the same pool of tunnellers, sewermen and general labourers that London always seemed able to supply, whatever the danger on offer. You can imagine what the first morning underground must have been like for one of these new men, led along by someone who had survived the flood and now spoke of it, if at all, in the flat, unbothered tone that experienced hands use to keep the fear at a manageable size for the ones just starting. It is worth resting here a moment if your mind is already drifting, because nothing that follows requires you to hold on to any particular name or date. The tunnel is simply being coaxed back into motion, the way a machine long stalled is coaxed rather than forced, a little pressure applied and then released, watched, applied again. But how do we actually know what the mood was like down there in these later years, once the newspapers had grown bored of the story and moved their attention elsewhere? This is where the record becomes unusually good, because among the engineers working under Marc Brunel through this period was a young man named Richard Beamish, who kept a diary of what he saw with a thoroughness that most of his colleagues never matched. Beamish was not the chief engineer and never claimed the credit that belonged to Marc Brunel or to Isambard, who was slowly recovering from the injuries the flood had given him. But it is Beamish's account, written down as things happened rather than reconstructed afterward, that gives historians their clearest window into what the tunnel actually felt like to the people working inside it during these later years. He wrote of the smell, of the sounds the shield made as it was worked forward, of the particular exhaustion that came from a full shift spent bent nearly double in bad air. And he wrote of the men themselves with a respect that many accounts from this period do not bother to extend to labourers at all. It is Beamish who records the day-by-day return of ordinary routine, the small, unremarkable facts that tell you a workplace has steadied itself again, shifts changing on schedule, meals taken at the usual hour, the shield's frames being worked forward foot by foot without any fresh disaster to record. There is something almost soothing in reading his pages from this period, not because the danger was gone, but because the note of alarm that runs through the earlier accounts of the flood has quietened into something closer to grim professional attention. You get the sense, reading him, of men who have made their peace with a level of risk that would seem intolerable in any ordinary trade, and who have found in that peace a kind of steadiness that lets the work continue at all. Beamish also captures something else, which is the way Marc Brunel himself carried these months. He was no longer a young man promising a brilliant invention to a curious public. He was an engineer well past his best years, watching his own son recover slowly from injuries the tunnel had given him, and pressing forward anyway because there seemed no other direction left to press in. Beamish does not dramatize this. He simply records it, the way he records the humidity readings and the state of the brickwork. And it is in that plainness that the weight of it comes through most clearly, in the same way a quiet note in a doctor's ledger can carry more than a loud one. And it was against this steadied, careful, watchful background that the shield began at last to move again toward the northern bank. You would have felt it before you understood it, standing near the face during a shift in these months, a rhythm returning to the work, jacks driving forward, brickwork rising close behind, the whole slow machinery of the tunnel finding its stride once more after the long interruption. The distance remaining was no longer the impossible span it had once seemed from the shaft on the southern side. For the first time since the water had broken through, the far shore was close enough that men could speak of finishing without the words sounding like bravado. Nothing was promised. The river had already shown twice what it was capable of, and no one down there had forgotten it. But the shield was moving, the brick was rising, and somewhere ahead, though still hidden by darkness and distance both, the northern bank was waiting to be reached. What that closeness did, more than anything, was change the arithmetic of risk that every man underground carried in his head without ever saying so aloud. 100 feet of clay and gravel still separated the face from the northern shaft, but 100 feet was a distance a man could hold in his mind whole in a way that the original span of the river had never quite allowed. You could pace it off against something familiar, the length of a street, the run of a warehouse floor, and it would stop being an abstraction and start being a thing that might actually end. Beamish notes a shift in the talk among the miners around this time, a willingness to speak of the far bank as a place rather than an idea, and there is a particular kind of relief in that, the relief of men who have started allowing themselves to imagine an ordinary Tuesday on the other side of the work. The brickwork behind the shield kept its own patient rhythm through all of this, ring after ring closing up the tunnel's mouth as the frames advanced, and it was in watching that ring close over and over without incident that trust in the work began quietly rebuilding itself, one completed yard at a time, long before anyone thought to call it trust at all. The last stretch was the strangest part of the whole enterprise, though nobody could quite say why at the time. You would think the closer the work came to the far shaft, the more certain it would feel, and in a sense it did. The surveys agreed, the sightings from both banks lined up within inches. The men driving the shield could feel in their own bodies that the ground ahead was thinning towards something rather than simply continuing forever the way it had for so many months before. And yet there was a kind of held breath in it too, the particular tension of an ending that has been promised for so long that people have stopped quite believing in it, even as the evidence for it accumulates around them week by week. If you had stood in that heading in the last weeks, lantern light catching the wet clay walls, you would have noticed the miners glancing more often toward the working face than they used to, as though something might appear there without warning, though of course nothing would, not for a good while yet, Only more clay, more river silt settling its slow grey weight above the iron frames, more of the same patient work that had carried the tunnel this far already. The shield itself had not changed in all this time, not in any way that mattered. It advanced in the same manner it always had, cell by cell, a man working each small chamber of iron with his tools, while the great frame held the ground at bay around him, and behind it the bricklayers closed their rings as they always had, that unbroken rhythm that had done more than anything else to steady the whole undertaking through its long middle years. What had changed was the distance remaining, and distance, oddly, behaves differently once it becomes countable in a way it wasn't before. Early on, nobody could have told you how far off the Wapping shaft truly was in any way that felt real. It was a figure on a drawing, a bearing taken with an instrument, an abstraction resting somewhere in the unlit ground ahead. Now it had become a matter of yards, then of feet, something the engineers could mark on a chart and watch shrink week after week. And there is a peculiar comfort in watching a number get smaller when for so long it had refused to move at all. You can imagine what that would have done to the temper of the work. Men who had spent years bracing for the ground to fail them, for the river to find some new way in, began instead to brace for something almost harder to prepare for, an arrival. There is a story, often repeated though not always told the same way twice, that in these final weeks, the miners at the face grew quieter rather than louder, as though noise might somehow disturb whatever thin wall of earth still stood between them and the light on the other side. Whether that quiet was real or only a shape later given to the memory of it, something in it feels true to the character of the work throughout, which had never been won by celebration, but by the accumulation of small, careful, repeated acts. Isambard Kingdom Brunel, still recovering in body if not entirely in confidence from the injuries the river had given him years before, is recorded as having taken a close interest in these last surveys, checking the bearings himself more than once, unwilling, it seems, to leave so much confidence resting on other men's instruments alone when the end was finally within reach. But what does it actually take to know with any real certainty that you are about to break into open air rather than into more river, more silt, more of the same dark unknown that had swallowed so much of the project's money and so many of its years already? It takes in the end very little that would satisfy a modern eye: a compass bearing, a measured chain, a triangulation run between two shafts sunk on opposite banks of a river neither man could see beneath. And yet it had worked, all through the tunnel's length, close enough that when the final feet of clay were reached, the heading met the waiting shaft from Wapping with barely any correction needed at all. There is something almost embarrassingly simple in that, once you sit with it a while in the dark, that so vast an uncertainty could be resolved by such ordinary tools wielded with enough patience. If your eyes are already closing, let that thought rest there a moment. That the greatest reassurance in this whole story so far has come not from any dramatic rescue, but from measurement, quietly proven right. The actual breach, when it came, is described in the surviving accounts with a restraint that might surprise anyone expecting drama. There was no explosion of earth, no sudden flood of daylight pouring in as though a door had been thrown open. The last thickness of clay between the advancing face and the waiting shaft at Wapping had been reduced, foot by foot, to little more than a curtain, thin enough that the miners working it could feel, or believed they could feel, some faint change in the air pressing back at them from the far side. When it finally gave, it gave in pieces, broken through with picks rather than torn open all at once. And what came through first was not light at all, but simply air, a different air, cooler, carrying with it some trace of the open shaft beyond, distinct enough from the close, worked atmosphere of the heading that men who had spent years underground noticed it immediately, the way you might notice a window open somewhere in a house you know by heart. Only after that came the first thin seam of daylight, filtering down from the Wapping shaft above, faint and grey and utterly unremarkable in itself, and yet received, by every account, with something closer to quiet than to cheering. You have to sit with that stillness a moment to understand it properly. This was not a triumph arriving out of nowhere. It was the end of a debt finally being paid. a debt owed to years of flooded headings, collapsed ground, foul air, fever, and the drowned men whose absence had shaped so much of the work's caution ever since. There is no record of wild celebration at the moment of breakthrough itself. A handshake, perhaps. A quiet word passed along the line of men still standing in the heading, lanterns lifted toward a gap that had, until a few seconds before, been simply more clay. Marc Brunel, by then an old man worn thin by decades of worry over this single crossing, is remembered as having received the news with something closer to relief than delight, the relief of a man finally permitted to stop holding his breath. If you have ever finished something that took far longer than it was meant to, something that cost you more than you were prepared to pay, you will know that particular flavor of arrival, quiet, almost tired, entirely unlike the picture you once had of how it would feel. What followed the breach was not an ending so much as a tidying, though it took its own long while to complete. The brick lining, which had trailed the shield in its patient rings for so many years, still had work to finish along stretches of the tunnel where the advance had outpaced it slightly, and so for some further months the bricklayers continued their steady closing of the tube, even as the heading itself stood open at both ends for the first time since the work began. There is a particular satisfaction, familiar to anyone who has worked on a long structure, in watching the last gaps in a lining close up behind a finished bore, the sense of a wound sealing rather than merely stopping. When the brickwork was at last complete along the tunnel's whole length, what existed beneath the river was no longer two advancing faces reaching for each other through the dark, but a single continuous vault, lined and sound from one shaft to the other, waiting only to be made fit for the people it had been built for all along. That fitting out took its own quiet season of work. A roadway was laid along the floor of the twin arches, level enough for foot traffic, though the grander plans for carriages descending by ramp had long since been abandoned, along with so much else that had once been promised. Gas lighting was fixed along the length of the tunnel, iron brackets carrying their small, steady flames at intervals into a darkness that had, for years, belonged only to men working by lantern and candle. If you had walked through in those last weeks before it opened, you would have felt underfoot a floor that had not existed a season before, and overhead a string of gaslights receding ahead of you into a curve too gentle to see the end of. The whole tunnel lit now, not for engineers checking bearings, but for ordinary feet, ordinary curiosity, ordinary Tuesdays that had once seemed almost too ambitious to imagine. It is worth resting a moment on what this quiet completion actually represented, because it can be easy at this distance to let it pass as simply the next expected step. This was the closing of a bore first opened in a shaft sunk years before, under a very different set of hopes and a much thinner sense of what the ground beneath a river might do to those who tried to cross beneath it. Men had drowned reaching this point. Money had run out and been found again. An entire second beginning had been required after the river first broke in and very nearly ended the whole ambition for good. And now, without ceremony beyond the ordinary business of finishing a job, the last brick was in place, the last lamp was lit, and a path lay open under the Thames from one bank to the other, waiting only for the doors to be thrown open to the public, who would soon come looking for something more like wonder than like engineering. The crowds began gathering before the sun was properly up, word having spread through the city that something long promised was finally to be allowed. If you had joined that line on the first morning, you would have stood for what felt like hours among porters and clerks and off-duty soldiers, all pressing toward a stairway that led down into the earth rather than up into the sky, which by itself seemed to trouble people who had spent their lives being told that the only respectable direction to build was upward. When your turn came at last, and you started down the shaft, the noise of the street would have fallen away behind you with each step, replaced by something stranger still. A hush broken only by footsteps and the low murmur of many voices, carried oddly along brick and iron, softened and stretched by the curve of the vault overhead. At the bottom, the tunnel did not look like the tunnel you might have imagined from all the years of hearing about it. It had been finished not as a bare passage, but as something closer to an underground promenade, twin-arched roadways divided by a row of columns, each archway lit by gas flames set behind glass, throwing a steady amber light along walls that had been rendered smooth and pale. Small stalls had already been fitted into recesses along the route, selling prints of the tunnel itself, souvenirs stamped with its likeness, trinkets that let you carry a piece of the marvel back up into daylight. A band played somewhere ahead of you, its notes bending strangely in the enclosed air. You would have felt the damp on your skin before you noticed it consciously, a coolness that had nothing to do with the season above. And you would have felt, too, the peculiar weight of knowing that a river moved somewhere over your head, silent and enormous, while you stood dry and lit and safe beneath it. That contradiction, the water so near, the danger so recently real, the ease with which you could now stroll where men had drowned, was very much the point of the spectacle, and the crowds seemed to sense it without needing to be told. In the months that followed, people came from every part of the country, and from a good deal further, arriving by coach and by river steamer specifically, to walk from one bank of the Thames to the other without ever touching a boat. Newspapers described it in the language usually reserved for the ruins of the ancient world, and some writers of the day placed it without embarrassment alongside the pyramids and the great aqueducts of Rome, calling it a wonder fit to stand among the wonders history had already agreed upon. If you drift a little here, that is no trouble at all. None of this is a thing you need to hold on to, only a scene to let pass in front of you, lantern light and brick, and the murmur of strangers underground. What the crowds did not get, and what the tunnel's promoters had promised for decades, was traffic of the ordinary kind. The carts and wagons and rolling commerce that had been the entire justification for digging beneath the river in the first place. The spiral ramps meant to carry horses and vehicles down to the tunnel's level were never built. The money that might have paid for them had long since gone into simply finishing the passage itself, and no further funds could be found once the doors were open and the novelty was already earning its keep. So the tunnel that had been conceived as a road beneath the Thames became, in practice, a tunnel for feet alone, a place you walked through rather than rode through, a curiosity you paid a toll to enter rather than a route you used to move your goods to market. Merchants who had once imagined wagons of coal and timber and cloth passing beneath the river instead found their tunnel filled with pleasure seekers buying commemorative handkerchiefs, and in time, that difference between what the tunnel was meant to do and what it actually did would decide most of its later history. But wonder of that kind rarely lasts at full strength for very long, and it is worth asking what becomes of a marvel once the crowds who came to gawp at it have gone home and told everyone they know, and there is no one left to astonish. The answer in this case unfolded slowly, the way most true answers do. The novelty did not vanish overnight, but it thinned year by year as the tunnel settled into a stranger and quieter reputation. The bazaar in the archways persisted for a long while, but the character of what happened down there began to shift with the character of who still came, and the passage beneath the river gradually became known less as an engineering marvel and more as a place where the respectable avoided going after dark, its shadowed arches taking on a different sort of story than the one its builders had intended. If you were walking those arcades a generation after the opening, you would have found the gas lamps dimmer, the crowds thinner, the stalls selling less to travelers and more to loiterers, the whole promenade beginning to feel like a monument that history had quietly moved past. Tourists came and photographs were taken, but the great crossing itself, robbed of its intended traffic, had become something closer to a fairground attraction lodged permanently beneath a river, waiting to be told what it was actually for. That telling came, eventually, from a direction none of its original builders had planned for. Railways had by then transformed the world above the tunnel almost beyond recognition, threading the city with lines and stations where once there had been only streets and wharves, and a company looking to extend its reach beneath the Thames found, ready-made and already proven against the worst the river could do, a tunnel that had spent decades waiting for a purpose worthy of the ground it had cost. The passage was bought, its promenades and its ironwork given over to a new use, and the twin archways that had once carried strolling crowds past souvenir stalls were fitted instead with rails. Trains began to run through the tunnel that had first been meant for horses and carts, then had served for years as a place to walk and wonder, and the transformation, when it finally came, felt less like an ending than like the tunnel finally being asked to do serious work again. It carries trains still, part of a network that has changed its name and its ownership many times since, but the brick that Marc Brunel's shield first pushed forward beneath the river remains the same brick, doing service that has simply changed its shape. Marc Brunel himself lived to see his tunnel finished and to see the crowds pass beneath the water he had once nearly lost his life and his son's life trying to cross. He was made a knight not long after the opening, an honor that recognized, rather late and rather quietly, the years of debt and doubt and near ruin the project had cost him. He grew old slowly in the years that followed, his health worn by decades of strain in ways that no medal could repair, and he did not live to see the tunnel's later transformation into a railway, dying while it was still a place people walked through for pleasure rather than passed through on their way somewhere else. His son fared very differently, and it is worth pausing on that difference because the tunnel had shaped him as surely as it had shaped the ground it passed through. Isambard Kingdom Brunel had gone down into that shaft as little more than a young man barely out of his boyhood, had nearly drowned there, had spent months recovering from injuries the river had given him, and had come up from all of it with a reputation for nerve and competence that no amount of family connection could have bought him on its own. The great works that made his name known across the country and beyond it, the railways, the bridges, the iron ships larger than anything the world had yet floated, all came after the tunnel, and all of them, in one way or another, drew on lessons the river had taught him first. How to manage men in danger, how to keep faith with the design when the ground itself seemed to argue against it, how to carry on when money and confidence both threatened to run out at once. And the record of what had actually happened down in that shaft, the flooding and the fires and the long grinding years between them, survived in large part because one man who had been there chose long afterward to write it all down. Beamish, who had worked at Marc Brunel's side through the worst of it, spent his later years setting the whole account into a memoir that preserved details the newspapers of the time had never troubled to record, the wages, the injuries, the small decisions made underground that no one but the men present would otherwise have remembered. It is largely through his patience that so much of this story can still be told with any confidence at all, and it is to what came after him, to what the tunnel and the men who built it left behind in the ground and in the record, that the story now turns. A tunnel, once it is finished, stops belonging to the men who dug it. It belongs to whoever walks through it next, and for a long time after the river closed over the roof of the Thames tunnel, it was not trains that passed beneath the water at all, but crowds. If you had come down the spiral stairs of the Rotherhithe shaft in those first years, lantern light catching the white paint on the brickwork, you would have found something closer to a fairground than an engineering workie. Stalls selling trinkets and hot pies, a man playing a barrel organ somewhere in the echo, the smell of naphtha lamps mixing with damp stone and the peculiar mineral coolness that only ever exists that far below a river. People came from all over the country and beyond it, paying their tolls simply to say they had walked under a river's own bed, and for a while that curiosity was enough to keep the tunnel alive, long after the money and the ambitions that built it had quietly run their course. But a tunnel built to carry carriages that never came, and a fare that could not sustain itself forever, is not a tunnel with much of a future. And it is to what became of it, and of the men who made it, that this last part of the story now turns. The carriage ramps that Marc Brunel had once drawn so carefully into his plans were never built. There was no money left after the crossing itself, and so for close to 20 years the tunnel served only foot traffic, its promise as a road under the Thames unrealized, its two lower arches given over instead to shops in little brick alcoves that still, in places, survive in the tunnel today. You can find photographs from that era, if you go looking, showing top-hatted visitors posed stiffly under the gaslight, and it is worth sitting with the strangeness of that image for a moment. A structure that had cost so many years and so many lives, reduced in its public life to a novelty beneath the water, a place to be seen having visited rather than a road anyone actually needed. Marc Brunel himself lived to see this. He was made a knight for the achievement. an honor that acknowledged what the tunnel had meant to the engineering world, even as its practical purpose remained unresolved. And he continued to visit the site in his later years, an old man walking again through a passage he had once measured in inches of daily progress, each one paid for in a way the visitors buying their pies could never have guessed. It was the railway, in the end, that gave the tunnel the life its builders had always intended for it, though not in a form either Brunel would have recognized. In the 1860s, decades after the shield had made its final push into the Wapping shaft, the tunnel was bought by a railway company and fitted with tracks, and the passage that had once carried sightseers with lanterns began instead to carry steam trains and later electric ones in a use that has never really stopped since. If you have ever ridden the London Overground between Rotherhithe and Wapping, or in earlier years the East London line before it, you have very likely passed through the same brick tube that Marc Brunel's shield pushed forward one small frame at a time, the same walls that the men behind those frames braced with their shoulders and their timber while the river pressed down from above. There is no fanfare to it now. The train does not slow. There is no announcement marking the crossing, and most of the people riding through have no idea that the dark stretch beneath their feet was once thought by engineers across Europe to be an impossibility, a project too dangerous and too expensive ever to finish. You do not need to remember any of this to pass through it safely today, which is itself a kind of monument, an achievement so thoroughly absorbed into ordinary life that it has become invisible, the way the best engineering usually does. But what became of the men who built it? Once the work was done and the river closed over their heads for good, what happened to the ones who carried the frames forward, who breathed the foul air, who watched the water come through the ceiling and lived to talk about it afterward? For most of them, the record simply falls silent, the way it does for almost everyone who works with their hands rather than their name on a drawing. The miners and bricklayers who spent years crouched in that iron shield, the laborers who hauled spoil up the shaft in buckets, the women who worked the pumps and carried water and food down into the workings, one of hundreds whose names no ledger troubled to keep. They scattered back into the ordinary working life of London once their wages stopped, some of them carrying injuries or a cough that never fully cleared, most of them leaving no trace beyond the pay records that Beamish so carefully preserved. It is a peculiar kind of debt that history owes to men like that, a debt it can never quite repay because it never learned their names in the first place. And if there is a quiet sadness in this story, it sits there, in the ledger entries that only ever list a wage and a task and nothing else. Isambard Kingdom Brunel fared rather differently, as you might expect of a man who went on to build bridges and ships that still carry his name today. The flooding that nearly killed him in the tunnel left him with injuries that troubled him for months afterward, and by his own account it was during his slow recovery, sent away from London to convalesce, that he first turned his attention seriously toward the railway and bridge projects that would occupy the rest of his working life. There is something almost unbearably fitting in that the tunnel which so nearly ended him also gave him the recovery time in which his next great career began to take shape, as though the Thames itself had only delayed him rather than defeated him. He would go on to eclipse his father's fame within a decade, and yet by his own account and by Beamish's, he never spoke of the tunnel as anything less than his true apprenticeship, the place where he had learned, at enormous personal cost, what it actually took to force an engineering ambition through ground that did not want to yield it. Marc Brunel, for his part, grew old more quietly. He continued to design and to consult, but the tunnel remained the singular achievement of his career, the one project that outlasted every setback that might reasonably have ended it. And by the time of his death, he had lived long enough to see it not merely completed, but absorbed into the ordinary geography of the city. A fact of London, the way a bridge or a church becomes a fact. No longer an argument or a gamble, but simply a thing that is there. If you were to stand today at either end of the tunnel, at Rotherhithe or at Wapping, above ground where the shafts once stood, you would find very little to mark what happened beneath your feet a couple of centuries ago. A plaque, perhaps, easy to miss. Easy. The engineering itself, the shield and its principle of advancing a tunnel behind a moving shell of iron, while the ground was held safely at bay, went on to shape almost every tunnel driven through soft ground anywhere in the world afterward. From the London Underground itself to tunnels beneath rivers on continents Marc Brunel never visited. That is perhaps the truest afterlife any engineer can hope for. Not a monument with his name carved into it, but a method so useful that it simply becomes the way things are done, unremarked, invisible, everywhere. There is nothing you need to hold on to from any of this. The details will still be here another night if your eyes have already closed. What matters, if anything does, is only the shape of it. A river that could not be crossed, a shield that inched forward one frame at a time through ground that fought every foot of it. A handful of men whose names survived, and a great many more whose names did not, and a tunnel that outlived every doubt ever raised against it, quietly carrying trains beneath the water to this day. The river kept its silt and its darkness and its danger, and gave back, in the end, a road beneath itself that has never once failed since. Thank you for spending this night with me, wherever in the story sleep finally found you. If you drifted off somewhere back at the shield or the flooding or even earlier than that, none of it was going anywhere. It will keep the way the tunnel kept, waiting quietly under the water for whenever you're ready to come back to it. If you'd like to hear about another structure like this one, I'll be back with more of them here on the channel. For now, though, there's nothing left to do but rest. Sleep well.